What a beautiful question. Are you ready? What a beautiful question. Yeah, what a beautiful question around the integrating of the masculine and the feminine energies within us, and how does one actually do that? How does that actually work? And particularly for a woman, how would she incorporate more of masculine so-called traits if that was a thing? Because it seems to be quite easy for women to look at men and recognize the feminine traits that they could work on within themselves to be more calm or balanced. And of course, I can only speak from my own experience and my own awareness. But when I look through a lens of syntropy at this, and what I know about sacred union in the sound of it, becoming a holy partnership and being in a holy field of relating, which would serve the function and the purposeful function to help each other's soul growth come about. And soul growth comes about, the soul doesn't need to grow. The soul is already complete. It's that we have been through programming conditioned to operate so much on the mind, and with that the so-called ego that seems to be operating in great activity, because the world of men is not necessarily a safe place to operate freely in. That's because it's operating on conflict and competition as opposed to contribution and celebration and co-creation. And in the field of the world of men, where we then get the opportunity, and we've chosen to incarnate, to have another soul journey, it seems from my own observing and studies, and also what I would call my soul's attraction, is to deepen my remembering on the side of her story. I've been raised with his story. It's just a bunch of statistics of how many times we went to war, where, and for how long, and much of it is fabricated. It's very commonly known that only the victorious would ever write history, because the defeated party didn't really have much to say because they were the losers. And so this world of competition has been with humanity for a very long time, and it's all just human damage. It's grown-up human beings practicing fantasies as if it's a reality, that those people are less than us, or they have land that we should have, and because we want it, and I'm the emperor, and or the king, or the whatever, the baron, whatever it was. And of course, there have always been bandits, and peoples did need protection, but that's all reactionary approaches to humanity already having fallen so far out of the natural order, and that it is of course not natural to go and wage wars against another people's. That's pure and unadulterated human damage in its own accord. And of course, the suffering and the trauma that gets inflicted with that then becomes trauma-based imprinting of the gravest degrees that takes generations to resolve. And we see through the course of so-called history that these conflicts between nations and peoples that identify themselves as a particular name or a particular type, those conflicts are ongoing, and yet peace and piecing is something that is only natural to arrive at. And so through the successions over time, we can see that ultimately that's the only vantage point that we're going to reoccupy again within ourselves and as peoples on the earth at large, that peace and therefore prosperity becomes about. And on a little side note, I have come to discover that because peace is a noun, we actually, and a noun being a still sound that isn't living. People all want peace because they don't want war or they don't want conflict, and yet peace in and of itself is not an action. It's being peaceful or operating in a peaceful orientation, which is mostly observable in our thinking as to how we are able to observe what's going on in our mind song. And so I'm introducing the verb piecing. If we want to arrive at peace, we got to engage in the process of peace, and we got to be piecing for ourselves. And when we apply peace to the external world and we want to arrive there at a larger playing field, so to speak, peace can only come about when we become peaceful within, and internally the conflict that we may actually have with the external world by observing other people's having wars and not agreeing with that because we want peace. It is always good to look at the narrative within where there actually was major conflict introduced into our world as a youngling, and how that has expressed itself and how that has imprinted on us, because our human nature is one of peace. And peace, with that, the peacefulness is also a sense of being free in the world, free of preoccupations with good and bad and right and wrong. And that doesn't mean that therefore we don't have feelings towards what we observe in the outer world being unlawful or unnatural or unholy. Ourselves know these truths. It's just that if we have strong emotional reactions towards it and we want to somehow create action to revert that or reverse that, love and acceptance leads to freedom. It's tough sometimes, especially when you look at what's going on in places like Gaza. And what is it that you can do? Well, you can go deep within and feel into the innocence that's being sacrificed and being harmed and being starved, and be with those feelings and really deeply feel the sorrow and the grief for the loss of our humanity that has lost connection to its human nature because we've seen ourselves separate from nature. And we've been raised in an orientation through our cult programming to operate in a way that human beings are separate from nature, that nature is operating outside of ourselves on its own accord, and we're mostly being induced into societal frameworks that are made up of concrete boxes and big highways and bridges and train tracks and airplanes and you name it. The industrial world is not the natural world, and yet the industrial world is entirely reliant upon the natural world to sustain any of it, to even develop any of it. And humans will forever be intricately and intimately connected and in a very healthy manner dependent on nature for its thriving. It's just that it's so obvious that we're so disconnected on a deeper level of our orientations and our belief systems and the ways that we navigate. It's so obvious that in the broad strokes of the world, the Western world, as I particularly like to address it, because that has had a huge effect on so many indigenous people through the process of colonization as well. And that's all been the influence of the Western world onto the whole of humanity. And there's just a huge chasm, so to speak, that currently is being mended. And it's being mended in in the natural world through practices like regenerative agriculture and regenerative agroforestry. And of course, through the lens of syntropic agroforestry, which is the study of how nature expresses itself through time, through succession, and what the strategies of life are truly based on, we get to also apply that onto human ecology and know that the spirit that lives, the spirit of syntropy that lives in all living things, is the same spirit that lives in human cells. And that is a beautiful place to arrive at, so that we can come home to truth that our cells actually know, because it is part of the intrinsic nature that life operates on. And when we speak in language around that, the language of syntropy, we get to remember and reconnect to intrinsic, innate, and inner knowing that we've always known since we were a child, but we were programmed and brought down and taught belief systems and structures on how to operate and how to perform and how to show up in a world that had already lost its primary connection of reverence and honoring and respectful navigation, and really contributing to those ecosystems and celebrating the abundance and the prosperity that comes about when humans engage in the natural world and cultivate those natural landscapes. Nature is entirely wired for abundance. And so we can see that the scarcity mentality that has been artificially programmed into our human civilizational wheel is there to extract wealth at some level out of the production, so to speak, of human activity. And this is all part and parcel of the meta perspective, so to speak. When we look through the lens of syntropy, we get to take a distance out of the triangle of trauma, and we get into the trinity of syntropy, where we can see how, if we were fully operating in our human nature as a human species, and we would all see each other as sovereign, we would all operate on a frequency of self-love. And with that, that emanates outward and contributes to the people around us through a process of recognizing their skills, their talents, their beauty, and celebrating people for that. And so very much the inner wedding, the inner alchemy, the inner healing, the inner unification that can happen with the world of man and the world of woman, the primary he and the primary she, with God and goddess, with all that men has done to perpetuate trauma into the human field of our ecology, and the beautiful natural feminine nature that actually humanity is intrinsically woven from. These are not just fantasies that I've come up with. It's just very obvious that we were knitted together in our mother's womb. And if we only for a moment dare to imagine what humanity would look like in 50 years' time if we switch those roles to males, I can guarantee you that all of humanity would go extinct, because in the natural order and the natural preordained hierarchy, there is this beautiful complementary and beautiful nature enshrined within the she to be that nurturing mother. And one could say, yeah, well, but that's obviously how it is. Well, it is like that for very purposeful reasons. But what has purposefully been deleted and obscured and covered up and hidden and denied and shut down and burned at the stake is her story. And so for a woman, it would be quite easy to see what sort of qualities a man could develop within himself in terms of the feminine nature that also is part of his nature, for he too was knitted in his mother's womb, and for he too was once a curious child, open and free and in love, loving life and loving the world and the wonder of creation all around him, with all that curiosity of why does the butterfly turn into a butterfly after the caterpillar wraps himself up in a cocoon, and why does the butterfly not fly if I break open the cocoon prematurely, and why does the sun go overhead and it sets, and why do we call nights night and mornings mornings, and why all that beautiful curiosity became, over the course of many generations, unwanted curiosity for reasons that can only be ascribed to human damage. And that mostly is because the grown-ups were already traumatized themselves, and the original innocence of the youngling and the energy that it has alive in itself would be suppressed yet again because it was suppressed in them. And so for a woman to see the qualities that a man could embrace within himself, I do have things to share around that, because this has been part of my journey for so long. I've never really gelled, so to speak, or felt in resonance with the world of men, with the matrix, with the industrialized and westernized culture that seems to be focused solely on the advancement of acquiring more material objects and rising in status to some degree by means of increasing the level of affluence. And there's nothing wrong with it, but it was the subtle energy that would coincide with that navigational orientation that felt off for me. And it wasn't until I discovered her story through the beautiful writings of Tom Kenyon that are encoded in the Magdalene manuscript that I, for the first time in my life, found that I was able to breathe. I was able to feel a homecoming in my body. I was able to have unquestioned questions answered for myself that I didn't even know I had. And of course, in my experience through the early years of my life, I was raised in the Christian philosophy and theology. And I didn't know that I felt that there was something missing, but my cells knew. My cells innately knew that the story I was being told and sold upon around me didn't feel as if it was actually the full truth. And it wasn't until I read those beautiful words of Mary Magdalene that a whole side of a story, her story, finally became available to me. And it felt so warm, and it felt so safe, and it felt so answering all these unknown questions inside of myself without even having the questions become crystallized and clear. I began to lean further into that path, the path of the rose. And I know from myself that there are many healing modalities to come to a place of more wholeness, and every healing modality on the earth is there to help heal and restore some sense of wholeness, some part of holistic health and inner well-being. And for me, I've leaned much more into the path of the divine feminine, so to speak. And it was partly because I felt more safe in that field, because the nurturing mother is such a more warm bosom to unfurl and do trauma release work in than to follow a mental health coach that is studied with the likes of Tony Robbins, that for me have always felt so intellectually driven and operating more on dissolving old belief systems by replacing them with new belief systems. And it always felt mental. It always felt rationalized. And I never felt fully met in my vulnerability and my rawness. And in certain circles, it was always spoken, it's a safe here, you can break down. And yet when I heard the word spoken, it always came from a mental attitude, as if we were just having to reprogram or hack into our programs to rewrite them. And of course, through my counsel from Sophia over all these years, the beautiful mother goddess of creation that has bestowed so much wisdom onto me about human ecology through the lens of Syntropy, I have found so many more answers about our true human nature. And so for me, I have leaned very heavily, so to speak, into the feminine pathway to soften and to become gentle. And really what that has meant for me is that I have become less hardened and I've become less judgmental, because I've increased my willingness to become curious and be open. And of course, my mentality has shifted into from a mindset into a mind song. I discovered my own mind garden, and that I was the one responsible for cultivating that. I leaned into metaphors based on the agroforest and applying that to my own internal landscape, which is a metaphor that can be extrapolated in all the stratas, from the depth of the roots in the soil to the outer branches and the flowering flowers that are trying to catch God's sunlight. The metaphors of nature apply to ourselves, because the spirit of Syntropy is being articulated in that process, and our cells are wired and operating on the same strategies that life outside of ourselves is operating on. It's just that we have forgotten that. And so I have found myself to become less hard, less harsh, less rigid, less stoic. And not that I ever felt that I was extremely stoic, because I feel that I've always been a little bit of a softer, gentler soul. And I can see that the Western world has programmed men to be very the masculine traits of protecting and making sure things are safe and having singular focus are all part of masculine qualities that are relevant, and they are obviously part of a the larger part of our male human race, so to speak. And I can see that in human nature, we are actually feeling-based creatures. And although men operate mostly on belief systems to not show vulnerability, to not show feelings, because that will be loss of face, or it will be dishonorable to not be your word. And those things all hold true within the context of Western society. I feel that when a woman asks about what are the qualities that she could develop more in terms of masculine traits, because she is able to witness what a man could do more of outside of herself, to become more receptive and more open and able to be more present and be able to receive more of what's relevant for her to express. This mostly has been effective in what is called the sacred union, the holy marriage, the holy relationship, where two partners commit to each other fully and wholly. And yet that commitment is, in often cases, and particularly in the past, not necessarily very clearly articulated as to what that means. Because marriage is just a noun, and a relationship, whatever that word actually really means, it's a boat of relation. And it's really a field of relating that we're navigating in together. But what's the intention that comes in that? And what's the willingness, and how do we show up in that field? And do we show up in our greatness, or do we show up in reaction? Do we further on conflict because we're not able to receive and listen? and deeply be present with what is alive in the other person? Or do we feel that they're attacking us by telling us that something isn't right? And so for a woman, it seems to me that it's not effective for a woman in her nature to develop more masculine traits and qualities. It feels that her coming to terms with the world of men and the resentment that she may still have, and the hurt and the pain and the projections and the reactions that she still has on behavior that she witnesses in men around her, is what she benefits really being with and feeling into and really sitting with and clearing that and accessing the primary imprint around that story. Because what comes about when she does that inner work, especially in relationship, we will find that our partner seems to be digging into us or triggering us. And that is pretty well true in many cases. We do have emotional reactions happening again based on the pattern that seems to be repeating itself again. And then it's for us as the willful self to be willing to go into that and ask ourselves, well, do I want to keep reacting like that? Do I want to keep justifying myself? Do I want to keep feeling that I'm not doing it right? Because maybe we're actually just not hearing what the other partner is actually saying, and we are reading their questions as projections, and we're reading their digging as open curiosity and willful support to get to a deeper level of where does this all really come from and how can we transform this together. I know that as I have done the inner work around the primary she, and I have learned to become better in my capacity to receive, my capacity to be present has increased, and therefore my capacity to relate from a feeling-based place has increased, because I willfully committed myself to that, which has made me more at peace and less reactive and less defensive and less on my guard that she may still think that I didn't do it right. And I am more able to be in the open curiosity to listen to what is really being said and receive that without it going through the lens of my former trauma. And so when women are able to find reverence for all the skills and qualities and the ways that men care, when women can cultivate again the honoring of the gift that a man represents to them because of how he's wired differently, because of his qualities that are singular focused and not into multitasking, that are into production orientated ways of navigating. They're strategized in that way, and there is clear knowing to some degree that is available in men as to what's going to work and what's not going to work. And when a man is devoted and in committed relationship, he will naturally, to the best of his capacity, do, and excluding narcissists here for a moment, he will do in the best of his capacity what he can to provide and protect. And it seems to me that the only work a woman would have to do in order to harmonize and come into balance internally with the world of men and the masculine traits and energies is to actually bow to them and to have reverence for them and to be grateful for the qualities that those skills and those ways of being represent. And when that reverence comes back, which often comes about by restoring the relationship with the primary he, which extends itself by extension as a he figure to God, the male God version. And what can assist very much in all of this is to deepen one's awareness intellectually and spiritually in the path of her story, Magdalene's story, all the goddesses that have been suppressed and cast out, so that we ended up with a male version God and only Christ as the great Savior. And yes, to me, Christ as a living imprint and the Spirit of God having become fully embodied, and the transcendence of death through his journey on the cross, and then his resurrection. All of that is amazingly beautiful, and up until this day, there has been no other story that has been more profound if it relates to how humans can become set free of sin, which really only means navigating in the past outside of the natural order and going in against that. But the story with Yeshua is not complete until we truly know that he also had a beloved from which he drew tremendous amounts of his capacity to overcome death. And that is her story. And when that story of her can infuse our remembering again of the fullness and the completeness, what we end up with is that the most significant in the Western world male figure actually had a beloved life partner that he was fully entwined with. And no longer, therefore, is marriage something, or relationship between man and woman, something that has only his story as the foundational underpinning in the Judeo-Christian traditions. There is actually so much more. And what happens is that empty spaces inside of our own internal landscape, particularly for women, but I can say for myself as well, there is a restfulness and a deep release and a deep oh wow. Initially there was a wow, I've been lied to, but at the same time that was just met with so much homecoming inside of myself, that what I had always known but could never put my proverbial finger on actually I had always been right. I had always known this. And this is a story that is really, really relevant when we talk about sacred union in relationship, and particularly the alchemical wedding internally inside of our own heart, inside of our own internal landscape. And this work is not done necessarily by increasing our feminine traits. It is simply by discovering where we are overusing and over-engaged in harsh frequencies that actually don't feel natural. And for she's, that can be that they're over-caring and that they're over-concerned, which doesn't work for a man, because then he feels disempowered in the sense of feeling emasculated. And because he's supposed to be a leader, but if he's wounded himself, he will play into that and still want the mother. You know, if you weren't breastfed as a man, that will for a very long time remain as a stain, because it is not part of our natural order as a human species to not receive colostrum and to not receive breast milk for a prolonged period of time. That is only part of it. And our cells are literally in innate anticipation. All children's bodies are in innate anticipation to suckle. And so that is intricately woven into the strategies of new souls coming into human body form. And when that is denied, of course, that's going to leave an imprint. And the imprint there is the premature separation from love, the love and the lustrous warm milk from the mother. And so these 5 primary imprints are really significant keystones to use in navigating our restoration of wholeness on the internal landscape. And it's not that we need to adopt or add on more traits. It is mostly that we benefit finding out what stories actually aren't fully true, and finding our way by navigating the internal landscape and finding that part of self that still holds that story and is stuck in that story, to let go of those stories and free those parts of self, and rescripting those stories so that true freedom, and with that peace and with that lovingness comes about naturally, because that is who we are in our human nature. And as men maybe listen to this, they may think, well, then I'm going to become some weak version of myself. And the full reality, as I see it, is that most men are only hardened and harsh and strong and all of that. That's only due to the world of men. If we actually stepped into nature as a civilization and we started honoring and we started revering nature as sacred again, and we became conscious co-creators together as families and tribes again, and we go into that field of imagination of how we would do it as a peoples of love together in nature, we would co-create and we would celebrate and we would continuously be willing to show up to contribute, because that makes us feel amazing. And these innate qualities that between men and women are complementary are only beneficial to exemplify and to celebrate more upon. A woman thrives when she's being celebrated for her beauty. He doesn't care about the details or maybe even the meal that he cooked for her and for him and how good it looks. He is in awe of her because her presence of beauty, by being who she is, feeds him, it nourishes him. That is why he is with his woman. And for a woman, it is her gift to be able to serve in that way and contribute to his well-being, and then receive reciprocally if he is awakened to that. And of course, that's where the inner work for men probably benefits being done equally as much as for women, for men to learn how to soften, how to compliment, and how to contribute with words of kindness and admiration, and thanking her for being a great mother and seeing her in her strive to do all the different tasks that are lying about in a household, and to celebrate her and their union by providing for in ways and means, by being able to go places and spend time in nature and hold hands and create time for that. And as he does that, she feels prioritized. And so this can be an hour-long visualization of how an ideal man and woman relationship would look like, and how a man would be showing up in his full nature. And I still know that if men listen to this, that they would be feeling that they would become less of a man if they're going to be prioritizing all of that. Because if I don't prioritize what I know I have to prioritize, well, then shit's going to fall apart. And that's all a story. And that's all part of dysfunctional programming that lives inside of our mind gardens and blocks so much effortless flow. And it really blocks men to become, in the proverbial sound of it, an embodiment of their own king, the qualities of a matured man that reigns peacefully with clarity and doesn't have to raise his voice, doesn't have to raise his hand over children, because love is the frequency that he carries himself with, and that comes with grace, and that comes with presence. A true wise man, embodied in his kingdom and in his inner kingdom, has done the inner work to also have deep reverence for her, and is devoted to serve her by cultivating the kingdom within and externally with all of his devotion. And that may mean going to work at 7 a.m. and coming back at 5 p.m. and doing it tomorrow all over again. And being in that, in a frequency that this is the path that he's on, and he can from that place perceive that more is possible, and he will do what he can in his capacity to work towards a field where there is even greater expanse of enjoyment and fulfillment. And what mostly sits in the way in our human ecology is that we have an ego that is, it's called the unintegrated mind. We have an unintegrated mind that, due to birth trauma and cult programming, isn't seated in the center of our hara as men, and that is the yoniverse, that is the womb, that is the center, energetic center from which we can feel our yay and our nay, the clarity that comes about when we heal the trauma that sits on that place, allows us to really navigate in a way that doesn't need to deal with all the intellectualization. When we integrate our mind back into ourselves, it will find that it has a more honorable and more righteous and more kingship-based function with purpose, and that it is to serve the soul's journey. And with that, it has the capacity to still care for and protect and provide safety for those that are his, so to speak, his woman, his children. And whether he does that from a distance or whether he does that in direct communion by means of co-living, when a mind becomes fully reintegrated into the body and doesn't operate helter-skelter in ways of keeping everybody safe and doing protection programs and accumulation programs and generating programs that are all hard and tiring at the end of the day, when he integrates his mind back into his body, then the trinity of mind, body, and soul can become unified, and the path of the soul that actually came here to incarnate into a human form can actually become walked with more delineation and more clarity, and the mind will be the one that is going to have to make the choices for that. But it will know the yay and it will know the nay, and it doesn't have to defend, and it doesn't have to feel like she's telling him he's doing it wrong. He can actually hear her because the mind is integrated into the throne, the seat and the seal behind the navel port. That's where he can truly bring his essence alive. And from that place, he can reign like a king, effortlessly, with clarity, to serve the purpose of why the soul came here, and to serve the kingdom in which his inhabitants, both his younglings and his wife or his partner, get to be honored and protected and carried to planes that are less frictionful and more peaceful and more enjoyable. And he becomes a generator. He becomes a generator and gets to see himself as such. And he becomes empowered in that place. And in the fourfold nature of our human bodily system, when the mind becomes integrated into the body, in the behind the navel port, into the throne and the seat of the self, where the mind will be plugged back into inner knowing and innate wisdom, from which then wise actions and wise dreaming can take place, that allows for the soul to actually infuse the dreaming of his visions onto a path where there is going to be more fulfillment on the purpose and the purposeful function why the soul came to earth. And what happens then in the fourfold nature of our human being is that the true spirit of syntropy that already operates the body, but we have an unintegrated mind, the full syntropic spirit of syntropy then actually allows the self and the integrated mind to make use of the full faculties of his powers. And he will be more empowered than he probably ever would have been if he remained unintegrated and isolated in the upper chamber of the head, trying to just run the control programs and run the directional programs and run the avoidance programs. Life works in such amazing ways that when we integrate our mind and we come home to God within and we honor that marriage, that sacred union with our feminine feeling-based nature, and the mind can humble itself enough to do the inner work to release the trauma, it will actually become seated in a place of beingness where its empowerment only increases, but it doesn't have to be expanded. It doesn't have to be expulsed. It doesn't have to be actually used. There is an inner knowing that it simply is there. And with that knowingness, reality shifts. We totally move off the reservation, so to speak, and we magnetize a reality for us that is infused with that spirit of syntropy. As I said, that our cells are already alive with, because what beats your heart and what makes you breathe, nobody thinks about breathing unless we go and do conscious breath work or meditation. And so the mind of man and also the mind of woman benefits becoming reintegrated. And for woman, it would be about finding resolution with the world of man and all the harmful and hurtful imprinting that the primary he and even the story of God as representing the primary he has caused damage in her belief systems, that her unintegrated mind is continuously running on. The self-shaming programs, I'm not doing it right, I'm questioning of the self. That only happens when a mind is not integrated. And so when she finds the pathway to resolution by listening to beautiful speakers like Alison Armstrong about how she can be more effective and gain so many more rewards if she understands what it is that really works for him, she gets rewarded in the process. And equally, it works that way for men. And with that, they can become each other's king and queen in full, not in material terms and terminology, but in soul journey terminology, where the archetype of embodiment of a completion can become expressed. And that only causes for a culture of contribution to become the driving force in which a man will just feel like he is alive. He is on purpose. He knows what he's doing. He's contributing his whole heart self and all of his cells through his will and his determination of his willingness to show up. He is a man that is thriving. He is alive, and he has an expanded capacity to care for her and for hers and his. And that comes about when he dares to bow to the queen and the feminine story of her story, when he dares to relinquish the stories of the church that were only filled with the patriarchal narratives that there was only Jesus. If that story is as incomplete as it is, then most men are operating on incomplete spiritual or religious orientations, and they have given boundaries and direction to so many people over so many generations, and it is a miracle that it's all still alive. And yet, what's even more so a miracle is that her story has been kept alive in the darkness and the shadows over all of this time. And this is the time where we're now, where these stories are meeting each other. And it seems all of a sudden that the story of Jesus all on his own actually had so many missing pieces to it. And she is the missing piece to that puzzle. And when those pieces come together again, there is a whole story. And therefore her story and honoring her story is so relevant. For the woman, it would be to reconnect with the fullness of her story, and to relinquish and release all projections and all stories ever held and stored against and in retaliation and in reaction to the world of men and all primary he's that have ever trespassed her sovereignty. And for man, it's to bow down and have deep, deep reverence for a story and her as the embodiment of that story. Because every woman is archetypally the expression of her story. No matter how asleep or how downgraded in her programming she operates, she still is connected to the source of all creation through her womb. And that is an access point to mystical and spiritual energetic portals through which the soul embodies itself into a new baby form. And also for a man, having come from the womb of the mother, for him to return to that and find union, sacred union and intimacy with that womb field of creation, him having reverence for that and honoring and deep, deep internal bowing for the sacred nature of that through the recognition that it's so God-made. It is a portal through which the soul comes into a human form, and then the baby becomes crowned as it comes out of the vaginal canal and burst into the world of light. It is just unimaginably, intricately, infinitely so beautiful, so knitted from divine and absolute supreme intelligence. And for him to cultivate reverence for that will allow him to not have to claim his woman, but she gets to be by his side, and he gets to show up as the great protector, provider that he is and can be. But he doesn't have to get anything out of her that he doesn't have in himself. Instead, he gets to pour into her through his contribution and through celebrating her beauty. And therefore, he actually gets to feel more powerful, because when she says, "Oh, thank you, honey. That's so sweet," he just gets, wow. And when we as a human species of the Western world gradually and over time, one by one, cross that threshold by doing the inner work individually for our own selves, in our own selves, releasing all stories for men around the primary she and the absence of the story of her story, and reintegrating that story again and drinking from that wellspring of beauty, that will resolve all the years of longing for the nourishment that wasn't enough, that the mother couldn't provide. And he will be filled up from within so that he can pour into her and she symbiotically pours back into him, and their partnership strengthens and their relating ways deepen, and their capacity to really reach the pinnacle of what their soul truly came for becomes accessible again. And when we cross that threshold individually and slowly but surely collectively, we will actually come to a place where we know that how we are living and the frequency that we're operating on, the natural frequency, that was actually only ever natural to be doing. It's just that we've been missing so much information. And for this, Syntropy is the missing link to be able to see our own programming through the lens of Syntropy, and being able to invert that programming back by re-enabling our nature, by recultivating our will, by being re-enabled in navigating our own internal landscape and undoing the programming of and the stories that still reside within us, upon which so many of us have been operating all this time. And that is part and parcel of integrating the unintegrated mind back into the body, so it gets to execute on its rightful place and its rightful role as the servant to the soul. And when that happens, with the spirit of Syntropy and the guidance of Syntropy already being there to help that reintegration come about, the true essence of Syntropy on a spiritual level and on a real physical manifested level will allow any human being to have not just the Trinity come alive of Syntropy, self-sovereignty, and self-love, but our soul in that triangle gets to embody that Trinity fully. And I have a feeling that when people arrive there, they will feel that it was always supposed to be like this, and this was only ever always natural, and they will have so much compassion for people that don't see it, and they will want to contribute in harmonic ways by speaking to this for other people to hear what else is possible, that it challenges that unintegrated mind substantially, but the cells know. And so anybody listening to this in correlation to the unintegrated mind, your cells know. And to women, your cells know because she knows. She, the wise goddess within, that is source connected to great Mother Sophia, goddess of all creation, through the womb field. Through the womb field, she knows that an unintegrated mind has the opportunity to become integrated, and curiosity can arise again in how to accomplish that. Because in her innate nature, she only wants to love on her husband. She doesn't want to be in fear or frantic panic that she's not doing it right, or she may not have done it right, or are things going to be okay? Is he gonna, why is he not? And what did I do wrong? And why can't he see? She wants to be in a place of peacefulness and surrender. And in that place, she gets to flourish. And that's something that man and woman, a beautiful he and she, can totally cultivate in sacred union, sacred relationship together, and commitment to that. And this having been spoken to that, benefits being heard, because for as far as I know, this level of depth and comprehension through the lens of Syntropy has yet to be made available at large to humanity all over the world. And yet, indigenous people already knew this. And indigenous people are still closely connected to this. And they too have been colonized, and they too have been trespassed, and yet there's something intrinsic in their essence still so much more alive than those who have come from the Western world and been brought down in that Western world. And yet it is all just here as a field for us collectively to transform illusions and delusions and distortions back into the fullness of truth. And it is a prerequisite that her story becomes honored, because through that she can become fully seen for who she is, as the divine partner to Yeshua, as the divine partner to him. And she doesn't have to become seen as less. No, she actually is his prerequisite. A man just all on his own can cultivate for years the beauty and love and reverence for all she's, and there's no harm done in forever remaining single. But the beauty that a man can experience by witnessing his partner in close proximity, being just who she is in her freedom, it's why he does what he does. It's why he shows up, And I feel that Syntropy, in this short tale of her story, can contribute greatly to have more comprehension on how to navigate that and how to arrive at that. And that it is not for women to necessarily adopt more male traits. It's just surrendering the ones that she has resisted for all this time and finding reverence for the gift of that treasure that lay within that trauma. And then she'll become free to magnetize a man into her field that will meet her exactly where she wants to be met. And there's still growth and there's still expansion, because life forever is wired on the Syntropic strategy to accumulate more quantity and quality of consolidated life into the system, into the cells, into the awareness, into the mind garden, into the consciousness, so that fuller and fuller embodiment and fuller expression can come about of the unique gift and talent that each individual soul has to express on this earth.